The Shaping Opinion podcast is brought to you by O'Brien Communications, an independent corporate communications firm. O'Brien Communications helps clients of all sizes with corporate communications and strategic planning, marketing communications, public relations and media relations, content development and writing, and crisis and issues management. Learn more at o'briencommunications.com. Do you have a favorite memory of New Year's Eve?
Well, I have two memories, and they're sort of at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And one is at some point when I was in college, I was home in New Mexico. I grew up in Albuquerque, and I was home for the holidays, and I decided not to go out New Year's Eve. I stayed home with my mother. My father always goes to bed early, so he had gone to bed, and my mother and I made a pear tart, and we stayed up till midnight in the kitchen watching Dick Clark's Rockin' New Year's Eve, eating the pear tart, and it felt just wonderful. And I always remember the sounds of people shooting guns in the neighborhood at midnight. I grew up in a little, right on the outside of Albuquerque. And I'll just always remember that night. It was a kind of perfect, quiet, contemplative moment with my mother and something delicious. So that's one memory. And around the same time, also when I was in college, I was in Egypt one year, and I spent New Year's Eve at a big party at the Sheraton on the Nile, and that was just such a memorable moment on the other side of the world with people who I'll never see again, but we brought the new year in joyously. And those are two sort of poles, I guess, of experience that I'll always remember.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Alexis McCrossen. She's a history professor at SMU, and she's written about a wide range of topics, including New Year's Eve traditions. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Alexis about New Year's Eve, with a special focus on the story behind the Times Square ball drop. If you plan to watch the Times Square ball drop at midnight on New Year's Eve, you're not alone. New York City expects to play host to over 2 million people for the festivities. Over 175 million across the United States will watch the ball drop on TV. And around the world, over 1 billion people will watch. 103 million people said they will travel 30 miles or more to celebrate the holiday. 93.6 million of those will drive. With all of this attention, we thought we'd talk to someone who knows a little bit about our New Year's Eve traditions, and that's how we found Alexis McCrossen. Alexis, you have studied U.S. cultural and social history in a broad number of areas. What led you to learn more about New Year's Eve traditions?
Oh, that's such a good question. I was working on a book on the history of timekeeping. I was looking at clocks and watches and other devices that Americans in particular, but obviously people around the world, had used and do use to keep time. And I kept coming across these photographs and engravings and paintings of children, sometimes naked, toddlers, sometimes in little diapers, stepping out of the cabinets of grandfather clocks or resting on the dial of a clock face. And I thought it was so curious. These were always sort of captioned with something about welcome to the new year. And I thought it was such a curious image. I was intrigued by that. I hadn't really thought of the new year as being a clock-based holiday in any way. I always thought of it as a moment of calendrical time rather than clock time. And as I began to think more and more about these images and trying to figure out what the iconography was exactly, I realized that the reason why the New Year is such a powerful moment in our holiday calendar is because it brings together the stresses of the calendar and of the clock in one moment, which is a kind of unique aspect of contemporary culture, and that arose or came together about 100 or 150 years ago. And so that took me down the path of studying New Year's, and the more I've studied it, the more complicated and interesting the holiday has become.
Really, what you're saying then is this is a holiday that's maybe the only holiday that's devoted to the passing of time.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure it's the only holiday, because after all, our birthday is kind of like a new year every year, right? A birthday celebrates the day you were born, but it also celebrates the passage of time. That is how many years since you were born. So there's that. Although most people didn't celebrate birthdays until the 20th century, they became popular in the Victorian period amongst the well-to-do, and then spread to the rest of the population in the early 20th century. I think birthdays are the only ones in New Year's that leap to my mind, but I suspect that there are other, that we could, if we were to sit down and think about it, nearly all holidays in one way or another speak to time at least.
When we think about New Year's Eve today, we often think about Times Square. We think of parties. We think of organized events at bars and restaurants. But I have some statistics. These are some pretty interesting statistics, thanks to WalletHub from last year. And I'll throw these statistics out. 49% of America, or the people that responded to this survey, said that they celebrate the holiday at home. And 9%, only 9%, said that they celebrate the holiday at a bar or restaurant or an organized event. And 23% said they don't celebrate New Year's Eve at all. And maybe it's the same 23%, but 30% said they fall asleep before midnight. And 61% said that they say a prayer on New Year's Eve, even though it's not technically a religious holiday. And then they did some other research. They asked people to rank their favorite holidays, and Christmas came in at 78%, number one. Thanksgiving at 74%, number two. Independence Day at 47% was number three. And New Year's Eve came in at 41%, and that's the fourth most popular holiday. So those are some basic statistics, but there's a big history to New Year's Eve. And it started a long time ago, and it evolved to what we do today. I don't want to necessarily go back all the way to the beginning, but I know that you've written about it, and you said that people have been marking the New Year for 4,000 years. Can you describe a little bit about how it evolved?
Well, in almost every culture across history that has kept a calendar of one sort or another, the calendar has a kind of rhythmic cycle to it. So there's a kind of repetition of days and seasons. And those cycles are different in different calendrical traditions. So the Mayan calendar, right, is different than the Julian calendar. But in all of those instances, there's a new year. And the new year can come at different times. It could begin on January 1st, like our New Year today, or March 25th, as was the case in Europe for many, many centuries. It doesn't really matter when the new year begins, but it's the idea of a new year at the beginning of that cycle of time. And so that usually communities and cultures will celebrate that in one way or another. They'll celebrate it with festivities, with thanks. They'll also celebrate it with rituals that stave off bad fortune and bad luck, right? So there's a kind of auspiciousness, right, to to the moment, to the event. Now, in most cases, until really very recently, New Year's festivities would have extended across several days, or even over a time period of a week or more. So it wasn't pegged to that moment of midnight the way we think of it today. That you could only celebrate New Year's if you actually did something on New Year's Eve and noted or were conscious at the moment of midnight. But in times past, even in the 19th century, New Year's could have been celebrated as a kind of season. And so that, I think, it itself tells us something about changing relationships to time and thinking about time over these many centuries.
You mentioned that there were certain rituals to augur good fortune. Can you describe some of those rituals?
Some of the rituals would have involved gift giving. So giving gifts. Typically, these gifts would have been exchanged between heads of households and the members of the household. They might have been exchanged between the sovereign of a community and his people or her people. So the gifts could have taken the form of tribute. They might have taken the form of tips or of trinkets. But these gifts set in motion a kind of good feelings and reciprocity between people that are necessary for living as a community over time and through stressful periods. So the New Year's always brought that opportunity for gifts, but the New Year's also brought the opportunity for what we might call symbolic gifts as well. In the 18th century, they called it compliments. So one would pay the compliments of the season by wishing another person a happy new year, wishing them good fortune, paying them that kind of respect that, again, kind of symbolically does the work of gift giving as well. And so these things would set the new year off on a good foot. This kind of gift giving, compliments. The compliments now today take the shape of those holiday cards that we send out, where we wish people a happy new year, happy holidays, a good 2019. So those are a couple of examples. There are others in ancient Rome. Sometimes twigs were exchanged. The twigs were thought to be kind of signs of good fortune. Eating particular kinds of food, like in the American South, eating black-eyed peas is a kind of creates a kind of auspiciousness for the occasion. So there are all sorts of customs and rituals like that communities and families engaged in over time.
You know, the one common theme that I've picked up in reading about this is that it's an optimistic holiday, isn't it? People are always looking forward to a better new year or a good new year, aren't they?
Right. It is an optimistic holiday. There is a lot of emphasis placed on hopes for a new beginning, hopes for a fresh start. This is where we get that emphasis on New Year's resolutions that seems to permeate our culture today. But underneath that optimism is a kind of melancholy, the melancholy of regret, the melancholy of retrospect, the melancholy of time lost.
Well, I looked at the history of New Year's Eve, and it seems like going back to the mid-1800s, the way we celebrate New Year's Eve today started to emerge. That's when people went to theater and they went to taverns and restaurants and hotels, and they would celebrate in that way. Around 1900 or so, you wrote that the moment of midnight became more of a focus in cities because they were illuminated with gas and electric lights. It actually was a very practical thing. And then there was the installation of public clocks and bells. So the combination of maybe the Industrial Revolution with electric light and gas light and public clocks and public bells, and all of a sudden we had this time around midnight on December 31st where it became this more important event. Can you describe how all of those things combined to create this event?
Well, you've just described it so well, but it absolutely is a kind of relic of urbanization and industrialization, of the crowding of cities with more and more people who left their small, cramped tenement homes, or maybe comfortable homes as well, and went out into the streets to celebrate. And the streets, instead of being dark and foreboding and places where only thieves and prostitutes and drunks crawled around, now the streets were illuminated, the sidewalks were clean, they were wide. Maybe they weren't so clean, but there was a kind of magnetic quality to the public streets and squares of cities, drawing people out into those streets for this kind of grand moment when these large illuminated clocks. Think of the clock on the Philadelphia City Hall, which is the each face measures 25 feet across. So these are huge, huge clocks. They're illuminated. They promise precision timekeeping. Whether they deliver on the promise is another question. When you have bells, and then you have these elaborate contraptions like the time ball on the New York Times building, which is illuminated and is going to drop at midnight. There are fireworks. The city turns itself into a kind of spectacle for this moment, this grand moment that's not associated with the church or with religion. It's not really associated with the state. It's not associated with the government. It's associated with time, with something that seems to be objective and that seems to be or is shared equally by everybody. Everybody is living in the same moment, regardless of their race, their class, their religion, their sexuality, you name it. They're all living in this exact same moment of time, and I think that's part of the kind of quixotic draw of New Year's Eve in these big cities that are industrialized and illuminated at the turn of the 20th century.
You know, when you look at the history of New Year's Eve, you can actually see how different kinds of peoples saw the same holiday in a different way and still came out with a feeling of hope at the end of it. And I think one of those points was actually a point in history when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think there's an interesting story there. Can you tell us more about that story and why that January 1st signing of the Emancipation actually had a reflection on the way we look at New Year's Eve?
Yeah, this is a really complicated story. I've been doing a lot of research about the relationship between African Americans and New Year's. And the story extends pretty far back in time, before January 1st, 1863, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1808, the United States enacted a piece of legislation that abolished the international slave trade. So essentially what happened was, on that date, Americans could no longer import slaves from the West Indies or from Africa. The legislation didn't abolish the domestic slave trade, it just abolished the importation of slaves. And for the free black community and for the enslaved as well as for white anti-slavery activists, this date, January 1st, 1808, seemed like a new beginning. It seemed as though Freedom's Day had arrived, as though this would inevitably lead to the abolition of slavery, to the manumission of slaves, and to a kind of equality at some point. And so there were celebrations in northern cities amongst white anti-slavery activists and African Americans to celebrate this abolition of the international slave trade. But as each year passed, it became more and more obvious that slavery was not going to go away, and that, if anything, slavery in the United States was thriving. And so the day, this January 1st, became after being treated as an anniversary and a holiday for about 20 years, it went into a kind of remission. And at the same time, January 1st, across the Slave South, was the busiest day of the year. It was called Hiring Day. And it was the day when slaves were hired out for the following year. And when they were hired out, it meant that they left the household that they were residing in. It meant that they left whatever relationships they were involved in, whether with friends, with husbands, with wives, with children, and they had to move into a new household. And so amongst African Americans, January 1st came to be known as Heartbreak Day. It was a day of real sorrow, of real anguish. It was a day that was anticipated, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, it was a day that was anticipated with terror and fear. It's not what we associate at all with the kind of optimism and new beginnings, right? Indeed, those are new beginnings, but not the sort that anybody would wish for. So when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Declaration, that is in September of 1862, when he essentially threatened the southern states that had seceded that if they did not rejoin the Union by January 1st, 1863, their slaves would be freed, would be emancipated. So when Lincoln issues that threat, September 1862, he's hopeful that maybe it'll bring the South back into the Union. But anti-slavery activists, freed people, and slaves who, if they had heard about this threat, anticipated January 1st with more energy and attention than I suspect they anticipated anything in their lives. And so when midnight of December 31st, 1862 arrived, there was a tremendous amount of joy, a tremendous amount of relief. Of course, the anti-slavery community had to wait until the middle of the afternoon, January 1st, 1863, until Lincoln actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He had spent the morning at a President's New Year's Day reception. It was a ritual that had been in effect since the 1790s, in which the president received all comers from foreign dignitaries and diplomats to officers in the Army to the residents of Washington, D.C. Even slaves were free to come to the White House and shake his hand. And so Lincoln had done that for 3 hours, and then he sat down and he signed this Emancipation Proclamation, making January 1st yet again Freedom's Day. But yet again, just as with the abolition of the international slave trade, this Freedom's Day is tinged with all of the sadness and melancholy that we see enacted in Reconstruction and in Jim Crow America, and even to this day.
Moving closer to today, moving through history, we get to the turn of the century, around 1900, and we talked earlier about the introduction of illuminated light and clocks, but that was also when things started to move towards New York City and Times Square. According to the people in New York, 1907 was the year that they actually began to do what they call the ball drop in Times Square. And can you describe a little bit about the history of that tradition and that ritual?
Well, the newspapers had all had their offices down by City Hall, down in Lower Manhattan. And the New York Times decided to move its offices uptown or to Midtown. And it moved in to what had just been named Times Square, and it wanted to draw attention to its new headquarters and to itself. And so it sponsored, the year before the ball drop, it sponsored a fireworks display from its roof. But the fireworks, the pyrotechnics, were a little bit dangerous. There was a kind of fire hazard associated with them. And so they had to kind of root around to find some other spectacle that they could offer up on New Year's Eve to draw a crowd. And especially to draw a crowd away from Trinity Church, which had been a gathering place on New Year's Eve for decades. People gathered to listen to the bells. and to draw crowds away from Lower Manhattan, from the town hall, and from the other newspaper headquarters. So it came up with this idea of the ball drop, and the time ball had been introduced in the 1840s in England as a way to help navigators set the clocks on their ships. There wasn't the kind of automated way that our phones, for instance, are sort of automatically reset every time we change time zones. People had to actually manually set and regulate their timepieces. And so time balls were this contraption that was meant to indicate visually the precise moment of noon, so that people who needed to have precision timekeeping could then, in theory at least, set their clocks to the exact correct time as measured by an observatory. It was called observatory time or true time. Well, you can imagine time balls are not exactly the best way to disseminate precise time. Think of the wind blowing, think of all of the things that could go wrong with dropping a large orb down a pole at a precise moment. But they were it's hard for us to believe this or to see it, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, time balls were considered a kind of the kind of height of modernity. So the New York Times, when it sponsored its illuminated time ball drop, was kind of on the cutting edge in a way. And it worked. People thrilled to it. They loved to see the ball sitting up there waiting to be dropped, and they loved waiting for that moment when it floated down the pole. And ever since, we've had the time ball drop, except for a few years during World War II when Times Square, like the rest of the coast, was darkened as part of wartime measures.
You know, you mentioned that it was modern at the time, but what I always found interesting was how low-tech it was in terms of how simple it was and how they did it. In 1907, going into 1908, that was the first year that they dropped the illuminated time ball. What they did, they used a flagpole atop one Times Square, and the first one was made of iron and wood, and it had 25-watt light bulbs. The ball itself was 5 feet in diameter and weighed 700 pounds. That was the first one, and they've had other ones since then. In fact, I have some other trivia about it today. They now have Waterford crystal triangles on it, the ball, and it weighs 11,875 pounds. So it's a sight, and it's very technical, and it's what they describe now as their permanent Times Square ball for the ball drop. What do you think has changed in the 100 plus years the most since they started doing the ball drop?
Well, the ball drop, I think, even through the 1960s was mostly a local phenomenon. That is, it was something that New Yorkers and, maybe people from New Jersey and Connecticut were aware of and might have taken a jaunt to Times Square to watch the ball drop, but it wasn't a national or let alone an international phenomenon. Now, in the late 1920s, on occasion, beginning in the late 1920s, on occasion, the radio would announce that the ball had dropped in Times Square, but it was far more likely, if you were listening to the radio on New Year's Eve, to hear famous bells chime. Obviously, right? It's easier to hear a bell chime than to listen to somebody describe a ball dropping. With television, in the 1950s, dance parties were televised on television, and the dance parties would occasionally cut away to a live feed from Times Square. And so this is when the ball drop becomes nationalized. That is when there's a kind of national awareness and attention to it. And then really it's in the 1970s and in the 1980s that the ball drop becomes a kind of a part of every American's New Year's Eve, whether they watch it or not. We're aware of it. It's a integral part of New Year's Eve, and sometime in the 80s or the 90s, it became a kind of international phenomenon. So I think that's the big change, is from a kind of local to a national to an international or a global moment.
According to the people in New York, over 175 million people across the United States will watch the ball drop on TV this year. And around the world, over 1 billion people will watch the New York City ball drop. Even though obviously people are in different time zones, that's still a very big focal point.
Right.
So what do you think when people from around the world, when they watch the New York City ball drop, what is the attraction, do you think?
I think the attraction goes back to the quixotic notion that we're all living in one moment in time. And this ball drop, in its own way, brings us all together for one moment. It's a kind of shared moment. There's this kind of simultaneity to it that for the rest of the year we rarely share. There's very little that we all participate in, regardless of time zones, across the year. We all have very different interests. Only some of us watch the World Series, and only some of us watch the Super Bowl, and only some of us attend election results, and so on and so forth. But something about this ball drop is magical, and it cuts across differences, even if just for a moment.
Alexis McCrossen, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a bio on our guest, Alexis McCrossen, and you will also find more information on our New Year's Eve traditions. You can also listen to other episodes. We want to know what you think. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find on your favorite podcast channel. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.